A few years ago, I visited my uncle's farm for a weekend getaway. It was a charming place with rolling fields, a big red barn, and a modest farmhouse. My uncle, a seasoned farmer with a rugged demeanor, had invited me to experience farm life and help with some chores. It was meant to be a relaxing retreat from city life, but one night turned out to be anything but ordinary. The first 2 days were idyllic. I helped with feeding the animals, repairing fences, and even tried my hand at milking cows. The farm was peaceful, surrounded by the kind of silence you can only find in the countryside. However, the tranquility was disrupted on the third night. That evening, my uncle had to run an errand, leaving me alone at the farm. I took the opportunity to explore the property a bit more. After dinner, I decided to investigate the old barn. It had been unused for years and was filled with dusty farm equipment and forgotten tools. I was curious about its history and wanted to see if there was anything interesting inside. The sun had just set, and the barn was cast in deep shadows. I grabbed a flashlight from the house and headed out. As I approached the barn, I noticed something odd: an old, rusty padlock on the barn doors. My uncle had mentioned nothing about locking it up, and I had seen the barn open before. I managed to pry open the lock and creakily swung open the heavy doors. The barn interior was just as I remembered: dark, musty, and filled with cobwebs. The flashlight's beam danced across the old machinery and wooden beams. Everything seemed normal, though there was an unsettling feeling in the air. I shrugged it off and decided to inspect the loft, which was accessed by a rickety ladder. The loft was cluttered with old furniture and boxes covered in sheets. I was rummaging through a dusty trunk when I heard a soft noise like someone shuffling or dragging something. My heart skipped a beat. I turned off my flashlight, listening intently. The noise was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from below, near the barn doors. Creeping down the ladder, I shone the flashlight around. The barn was still and silent, but the sense of unease grew stronger. I noticed that the padlock was now hanging slightly ajar, which was strange. I had locked it securely when I entered. I checked the doors. They were still closed, but something about the whole situation felt off. As I was about to leave, I heard the noise again, this time more pronounced, like footsteps shuffling through the barn. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I slowly approached the source of the sound, shining the flashlight around. The barn was empty, save for the old equipment and shadows dancing on the walls. Deciding it was best to leave, I headed for the door when I noticed something else: fresh, muddy footprints leading from the barn's entrance toward the back of the barn. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, with no clear source. I hurried back to the house, locking the door behind me. My uncle arrived later that night, and I tried to explain what had happened. He listened calmly and assured me that the farm had a reputation for strange occurrences, especially around the barn. He mentioned that previous caretakers had experienced odd noises and unexplained footsteps, but nothing had ever posed a real danger. He seemed to dismiss the events as part of the farm's charm, but I wasn't convinced. The sense of unease lingered, even though nothing else happened that night. The following day, I explored the farm's history with my uncle. We discovered that the barn had been used during World War II as a storage facility for supplies and had seen a lot of activity. Some of the old workers had stories of hearing strange noises and seeing shadows that couldn't be explained. Despite the creepy experience, I enjoyed the rest of my stay. We went back to normal farm chores, and the atmosphere returned to its peaceful self. I left the farm with a story that still sends shivers down my spine, but with the knowledge that I had survived a genuinely unsettling experience. The farm remains one of the most atmospheric places I've ever visited. Sometimes, the most ordinary places can hold the most unsettling secrets, and while nothing harmful came of it, the mystery of that barn still lingers in my memory. A few summers ago, I visited my uncle's farm for what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. His farm was tucked away in a quiet part of the countryside, surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods. It was the perfect place to escape the noise of the city. I had been there before, but this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the thick, humid air or the way the wind seemed to carry strange whispers, but I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that crept over me as soon as I arrived. The first day was calm enough. My uncle showed me around the farm, and we spent the afternoon tending to the animals and doing some light work in the fields. The house was an old, creaky thing, with wooden floors that groaned underfoot and narrow hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. It had always felt charming to me, but that weekend, it felt off. That night, after dinner, my uncle went to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room with a book. The only light came from a small lamp beside me, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I tried to focus on my reading, but my attention kept drifting to the noises outside the wind, the creaking of the barn, the distant calls of animals. Around midnight, I heard something strange. It wasn't the wind or the usual sounds of the farm. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was knocking on the window. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I slowly turned my head toward the window, but all I could see was darkness. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just a branch hitting the glass, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The tapping was too precise, too deliberate. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every few seconds, it would return tap, tap, tap. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered up the courage to get up and look. I approached the window cautiously, my breath shallow and my hands trembling. I pulled the curtain aside just a fraction and peeked out. There was nothing there, just the dark expanse of the fields and the silhouette of the barn in the distance. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back, feeling a little silly for being so jumpy. But as I turned away from the window, I heard it again, tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing outside, but again, there was nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone messing with me? But who would come all the way out here in the middle of nowhere just to play a prank? Unable to stand the tension any longer, I decided to check outside. I grabbed the flashlight my uncle kept by the door and stepped into the night. The air was cool, and the wind rustled the trees, but the farm was otherwise silent. I shined the flashlight around, sweeping it over the yard and toward the barn. Everything seemed normal. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, this time, right behind me. I whipped around, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing there. The tapping was gone, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I hurried back into the house, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was being watched. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the isolation of the farm was playing tricks on me. But the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, sent my mind racing. But eventually, the night passed, and morning came. The sunlight streaming through the windows was a relief, and the farm seemed peaceful again, as if the events of the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. When my uncle came downstairs, I didn't mention what had happened. He seemed his usual, cheerful self, and I didn't want to worry him. But as I left the farm later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. Even now, whenever I think back on that night, I get a chill down my spine. I never figured out what caused the tapping, but I know one thing for sure: I haven't been back to my uncle's farm since. A few years ago, I spent a weekend at a friend's family farm in rural Pennsylvania. The farm was sprawling and picturesque, with rolling fields and a large, old farmhouse that had been in their family for generations. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway from the city, a chance to enjoy the simple pleasures of country life. On the first evening, we gathered around a fire pit in the backyard, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The farm was isolated, with the nearest neighbor a mile away. As night fell, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hoots of owls. It was the kind of calm, peaceful night that makes you feel like all is right with the world. After a while, I decided to take a walk around the property to explore. I ventured out with my flashlight, heading towards an old barn that stood a few hundred yards from the house. The barn was weathered and worn, with peeling paint and sagging roof. It hadn't been used for years, and the door was slightly ajar. As I approached the barn, I noticed an unusual chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and the wind picked up, rustling through the tall grass. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The barn was filled with old farm equipment, hay bales, and dust. The smell of mildew and aged wood was overpowering. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating cobwebs and forgotten tools. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I was about to head back when I noticed something odd: a set of fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. The prints were large, and they seemed to lead from the back of the barn to the door where I stood. They were clearly recent, disrupting the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything. My curiosity got the better of me. I followed the footprints to the back of the barn, where I found a small, old trapdoor set into the floor. The trapdoor was slightly ajar, and the dark space below it was obscured by shadows. I felt a twinge of unease but tried to dismiss it as my imagination running wild. As I examined the trapdoor, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the barn remained still and empty. The rustling continued, growing louder and more pronounced. It was as if something or someone was moving around the barn. My heart raced, and I decided it was time to leave. Just as I turned to go, I heard a low, creaking noise coming from the trapdoor. I looked back and saw that it was now wide open, though I was certain it hadn't been when I first saw it. A cold draft emanated from the opening, and the rustling noise seemed to be coming from below. Feeling a mix of fear and determination, I grabbed a nearby pitchfork and approached the trapdoor. I carefully peered into the darkness but saw nothing beyond the pitch-black void. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I backed away slowly, not wanting to provoke whatever was making the noises. As I retreated, the barn door slammed shut behind me with a forceful bang. The sudden noise startled me, and I stumbled, nearly falling over. I hurried back to the farmhouse, my nerves frayed. I told my friend and the others about what I had found. They listened intently but seemed skeptical, chalking it up to an old barn settling or perhaps even a wild animal. We decided to check the barn together the next day, but by morning, the trapdoor was closed, and there were no traces of the footprints or any signs of disturbance. We spent the rest of the weekend without further incident, but the experience left me unsettled. To this day, I can't explain what I encountered in that old barn. The footprints and the rustling noises remain a mystery, a haunting reminder of how quickly a peaceful night can turn into something unsettling. Despite the fear I felt, I'm grateful that nothing more came of it, and I cherish the memories of the weekend spent with friends, even if it included a touch of the unknown. A few years ago, I took a summer job working on a friend's family farm. It was meant to be a temporary gig, helping out with chores and getting a feel for farm life. The farm was located on the outskirts of a small, rural town, surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods. The family was kind, and the work was straightforward, so I looked forward to the experience. One evening, as dusk was settling in, I was tasked with closing up the barn for the night. It was a large, old structure with creaky wooden beams and a faint smell of hay and livestock. I finished my chores and was about to head back to the house when I noticed something strange. A faint, eerie light was flickering in the distance, coming from the woods behind the barn. I initially thought it might be someone with a flashlight or a vehicle's headlights, but the light seemed to diffuse and too erratic. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to investigate. Despite the growing chill in the air, I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the light, which seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. The trees were dense, and the light flickered through the branches like a ghostly presence. As I got closer, the light grew more intense, casting long shadows that danced unsettlingly. When I reached a small clearing, I was shocked to find an old, dilapidated shed that I had never seen before. It wasn't on any of the farm maps or mentioned in any of our conversations. The shed appeared to be abandoned, with cobwebs hanging from the door and the walls sagging with age. The strange light seemed to be coming from within the shed, but I couldn't see through the dusty, grimy windows. My flashlight beam revealed no source of the light inside. My unease grew, but I pressed on, determined to see what was going on. As I approached the door, it creaked open slightly, as if someone had been trying to keep it ajar. I pushed it open wider and peered inside. The interior was filled with old farming equipment and broken furniture, all covered in dust and cobwebs. The light source was nowhere to be found. I stepped inside, trying to shake off the sense of foreboding that had settled over me. The light flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I began to explore, moving past rusted tools and old wooden crates. The sensation of being watched was palpable, and every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than usual. Suddenly, I heard a soft, almost inaudible whisper. I froze, straining to catch any words. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It felt as though someone or something was right behind me. I spun around, but the shed was empty, the light now fading into an eerie darkness. I quickly decided it was time to leave. As I hurried toward the door, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I rushed out of the shed, my heart pounding. The light in the woods had vanished, leaving only darkness, Back at the barn, I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But everything was as it should be. I locked up the barn and hurried back to the house, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that clung to me. When I mentioned the incident to the farm family the next morning, they were curious but didn't seem particularly alarmed. They mentioned that the old shed had been there for years, and that nobody used it anymore. They also said there were occasional strange happenings in the woods, but they were generally considered to be just local legends. The rest of my time on the farm passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange lurked in the woods. The experience left me with a lasting sense of unease and a newfound respect for the eerie and mysterious aspects of rural life. Sometimes, the scariest experiences are the ones that leave you with more questions than answers. The old shed and its inexplicable light remained a mystery, a ghostly memory from a summer job that I would never forget. Last summer, I visited my uncle's farm for a week. Nestled in a remote part of the countryside, the farm had been in the family for generations. I was looking forward to a relaxing break, away from the hustle of city life. What I didn't anticipate was the unsettling experience that would make this visit unforgettable. The farm was expansive, with fields stretching as far as the eye could see, a large barn, and several outbuildings. My uncle and aunt were away on vacation, so I was alone, except for a few hired hands who worked on the farm during the day. One evening, after a long day of helping with chores, I decided to explore the old barn. It had been unused for years, filled with dusty farming equipment and old tools. The barn was a bit of a labyrinth, with narrow pathways between stacked hay bales and old crates. It was eerie but fascinating. As I was poking around, I noticed a strange, faint smell, a mix of something musty and metallic. It was coming from an old, rusty door at the back of the barn. The door was partially hidden behind a stack of old feed bags. Curiosity got the better of me, and I managed to clear enough space to open it. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room that was cluttered with old farming implements and what looked like broken furniture. In the corner of the room, there was an old, tattered armchair that seemed oddly out of place. The smell was stronger here, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. As I stepped into the room, I heard a sudden, loud thud from above. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was followed by a soft, almost imperceptible scraping noise. It seemed to be coming from the loft area of the barn. I decided to investigate, though every instinct was telling me to leave. I climbed the creaky ladder to the loft, which was dark and filled with old and used items. The scraping noise grew louder and more rhythmic, like something or someone was moving around. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to head back down, I heard the scraping stop abruptly. I stood there, straining to hear anything else. The loft was silent now, and the only sound was my own breathing. I turned to leave when a sudden gust of wind blew through the barn, slamming the loft door shut behind me. Panic set in. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. I could feel my heart racing, and the room felt stiflingly hot. After a few minutes of struggling, I managed to pry the door open and climbed down the ladder as quickly as I could. I bolted out of the barn, not daring to look back. I spent the rest of the evening in the house, too unnerved to go back outside. The next morning, I mentioned the strange occurrences to the hired hands. They looked at me with a mix of curiosity and amusement. One of them, an older man named Tom, explained that the barn had a reputation for being a bit spooky due to some old family stories, but he brushed it off as just local legends. Later, I learned that my uncle had told similar stories about the barn when I was younger, tales of strange noises and unexplained occurrences. It seemed that the barn was known for its eerie reputation, but no one had ever figured out why. Despite the unsettling experience, the rest of my visit went smoothly. I kept my distance from the barn and focused on helping out around the farm. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, but I was grateful that nothing more sinister happened. The farm remains a place of both fond memories and eerie tales. Sometimes, the most unsettling experiences are those that leave you with more questions than answers. The barn's mysteries are still unsolved, but the memory of that night serves as a reminder of the strange and inexplicable that can lurk even in the most familiar places. A few years ago, my family and I decided to spend a weekend at a rural farm owned by a distant relative. It was a beautiful property, with rolling fields and an old farmhouse that looked like it had been plucked from a storybook. We were looking forward to a relaxing getaway, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, greeted by our relatives who showed us around. The farmhouse was charming, with creaky wooden floors and a large fireplace. Outside, there was a barn, a small pond, and acres of farmland stretching out in all directions. It was the perfect setting for a peaceful retreat. That first night, we settled in comfortably, enjoying a hearty dinner and sharing stories by the fire. By late evening, everyone retired to bed. I was staying in one of the upstairs bedrooms, while my parents and siblings were in other rooms. The night was quiet, with only the distant sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. It was a rhythmic tapping sound, coming from somewhere outside the house. At first, I thought it might be the wind or perhaps a tree branch brushing against the window. But the tapping persisted and grew more insistent. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the noise only seemed to get louder. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the house, near the barn. I lay in bed, my mind racing, trying to figure out what could be causing the sound. I wondered if it was an animal or maybe someone playing a prank. Unable to shake my unease, I decided to investigate. I quietly got out of bed and crept down the stairs. The farmhouse was dimly lit by a single lamp in the hallway, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and cautiously opened the back door. The night air was cool, and the stars were barely visible through the thick clouds. I shone the flashlight toward the barn, where the tapping noise seemed to be coming from. The barn door was slightly ajar, and the sound was coming from inside. As I approached the barn, the tapping stopped abruptly. I hesitated at the door, feeling a growing sense of dread. I slowly pushed it open and shone the flashlight inside. The barn was empty, filled with old farming equipment and hay bales. There was no sign of anything unusual. I walked around the barn checking the area but finding nothing out of the ordinary. The silence was almost deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After a few minutes, I decided to head back to the house, still unsure of what I had heard. As I walked back to the farmhouse, I noticed that the tapping sound had started again, this time coming from the other side of the house. I quickly went inside and checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The noise eventually stopped, and I went back to bed, though I didn't get much sleep that night. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to my family. They were skeptical but reassured me that it was probably just an animal or the house settling. We spent the day exploring the farm and enjoying the countryside. That night, we were all more alert, but the tapping sound didn't return. Before we left, I asked our relatives if they knew anything about the strange noise. They shrugged it off, saying the farmhouse had its quirks and that old houses often made odd noises. They didn't seem concerned, and they mentioned that others had reported strange noises in the past but had never found an explanation. To this day, I can't explain what caused the tapping sound that night. It remains a chilling memory, a reminder of how quickly the tranquility of a rural setting can turn unsettling. While we all made it through the weekend without incident and enjoyed our time on the farm, the mystery of the tapping sound still lingers in my mind. Sometimes, the most unsettling experiences are those that leave us with more questions than answers, especially when they occur in the dead of night, far from the safety of familiar surroundings.